So I'm going to reframe your question for you. And actually, if our online viewers want to ask something, they could ask it, and somebody will read it on the screen to me. You're asking a question about the pregnancy of Rivka and Yaakov and Esav, and the story that she would pass by a yeshiva, and the child who was going to be born as Yaakov got very excited. And you're asking, what did they learn? You could ask a question from the more recent Torah portion. When the Jewish people, or the family that will become the Jewish people, Jacob and his sons, are heading off to Mitzrayim, it says, V'et Yehuda shalach lefanav. So Yehuda is sent before everybody. Why is Yehuda sent before? So our sages say, Lahatkin lo beit Talmud, to establish a yeshiva. Right? Same question. What were they learning? It gets even better. The Medrash says that the three patriarchs studied Torah for 15 years, for 15 hours a day. What were they learning? And it gets even, I mean, in no particular time, but Yaakov runs away from Haran, runs away from Beersheba, right? He's leaving because Esav wants to kill him, and he's going to Haran because that's where his parents sent him. But somehow, 14 years disappear. Chronologically, 14 years are missing. What happened to those 14 years? So it says he went to the yeshiva of Shem ve'ever, right? Which Shem wasn't alive anymore, the yeshiva of Ever. And there are many other examples like this, of Torah being studied prior to the Torah being given. To sum it up, our sages say, Me'olam le'paska yeshiva ma'avisenu. Before we were a nation, when we were still just a family, there was never a time that we did not have Torah study. We were always studying Torah. What were they studying? Torah. They were studying Torah. Because the Torah ideas had already been conveyed to Adam Harishon, many Torah ideas. Adam Harishon actually authored books. He wrote Sfarim. Noach was a great Torah scholar. And he taught his son Shem. And Shem taught his son Ever. And the Jewish people received that teaching from them. Avraham Avinu, as a very young man, leaves home. This is not talked about in the scripture. It's before all the stories. We only hear the story, the narrative of Avraham Avinu's life when he's already 75. But as a very young man, he escapes from the king who wants to kill him, Nimrod, and he goes to the land of Israel, which is called Eretz Canaan. And he spends time with Noach. He becomes Noach's protege. And Noach actually sends him back to confront Nimrod and to promulgate a message of God consciousness. So what did they study? They studied Torah. The Torah ideas that we have today, they had also. Interestingly, when our father Jacob escorted Yosef off on his way for the last time, so the story goes that he escorted him. And then he bid him farewell. And the next time that Jacob hears that Joseph is alive is 22 years later. But when he hears he's alive, there's a concern. He doesn't know what kind of life. Is he a Torah Jew still? Does he still remember what he's been taught? And Yosef knew this would be an issue and a concern, so he sent a message in a hint. So he sent agalot, it says, sent wagons. And it says that Yaakov saw the wagons, Vatachi ruach Yaakov avihan. Yaakov saw the wagons and he began to live again. So the question is, why did he live from seeing wagons? Why didn't he live from hearing the news that Joseph's alive? It says, Vayara ta'agalot, Vatachi ruach Yaakov avihan. So the Medrash says, and Rashi quotes this, that the last lesson that Yosef studied with his father was about Egla Arufa. And Egla Arufa is the same terminology as an agala, as a wagon. Egla means actually a calf. And what the story is that if a person is found murdered, and we don't know who committed the murder, we have this unsolved murder, that we have to take a young calf and we have to behead it. And the elders have to come and they wash their hands over the blood. And they say, Yodeinu l'shafchu es hadam hazeh. Our hands did not spill this blood. It's not as if they're being accused of murder and they have to exonerate themselves and say, we didn't commit murder. But rather, Loi pitranuhu b'levia. We did not let him go with an escort. We didn't give him the proper safety. So Yaakov, when he escorts Yosef, he's explaining to Yosef why he's escorting him. So this is the last halachas they talk about. And Yosef sends him back a message 22 years later. I still haven't forgotten the last conversation we had. We have to finish that conversation. So they were learning halacha of Torah. And so it always was. In fact, the tribe of Levi in the land of Mitzrayim was not enslaved because Levi devoted itself to Torah. And that's why when the Pharaoh responds angrily to Moshe and Aaron, he doesn't say go back to work. He says go back to l'sivlotechem, to your own burdens. He doesn't say go back to the burden of your slavery, of the responsibilities you have towards the Pharaoh, because the tribe of Levi wasn't, in a sense, enslaved fully. Incidentally, because they weren't enslaved fully, they didn't merit the blessing fully either. They were a very small tribe. I just say one of the reasons they were a small tribe is because it says kasher yanu also kein yirbe v'chein yifros. As they tormented them, the more they gave them a hard time, the more they succeeded. It's a funny thing about us. The more people try to harm us, the more we succeed. But Levi wasn't so tormented. Why? Because they were busy studying Torah. So I just gave 6 or 7 different examples of documented concepts that we were studying Torah.
So it seems when Lot, the Malachim came to Lot, he baked matzah. And it says, "Ki Pesach haya."
Yeah. Okay. So this is a loaded question because it's about Lot. It's about Lot. But let me take your question earlier. Let's go back to the narrative before. And then we'll go back to Lot afterwards, and I'm going to try to give you some perspective on that. Right? Your question was, Lot, the Malachim came to Lot, and he served them matzah because it was Pesach. And you must be thinking, but there was no Jewish people yet, and there was no Galut, so how could you be celebrating Pesach? But like I said, the truth is the question already is in the previous narrative. The previous narrative, which the Malachim, before they go to Lot, they go first to visit Avram and Sarah. And what did they get served in the house of Avram and Sarah? Lushi vasi ugot. They got matzah. And Rashi says there also they got matzah, right? Why did they get matzah? Ki Pesach hoya. So obviously Avram Avinu did not know exactly how things are going to turn out. He didn't even know where his children would be slaves. God says your children will be strangers. The Eretz Lo Lahem. It doesn't say in Mitzrayim. He didn't know where. He didn't know the details. Avraham Avinu doesn't know there's going to be a Moshe Rabbeinu. He didn't know the whole future. But he was prophetically aware that at some point his children, who would become the nation of Israel, and the Torah would be given, there would be this concept of eating matzah. Did he know why they would eat matzah? Or the historical background of matzah? Or how the Jewish people leave Mitzrayim? How could he have? But he had this notion they would eat matzah. So he always ate matzah because that was the Torah idea, that he ate matzah. And we say Avraham Avinu was even keeping details of halacha that didn't come around till the time of King Solomon. Like certain eruvim, certain rabbinic loopholes that were put in place, or certain rabbinic safeguards, like eruv chatzeres and the eruv tafshilin, which are rabbinic safeguards to make sure that people would appreciate the sanctity and holiness of Shabbat versus Yom Tov. And Avraham Avinu was keeping that too. It doesn't mean that he knew exactly how and why what he was doing, what he did. So, but it's interesting, you started the question with Lot, right? Lot has deviated very far from the teachings of Avram. He moved to the middle of Las Vegas. It was an immoral place. He lives on the Strip, and he did all kinds of bad things, Lot. But we see this example in our modern day, that even very assimilated Jews, they still observe Pesach. It's the last Jewish observance to go is Passover. Even when people don't come to synagogue anymore on Yom Kippur, and we've arrived, unfortunately. That's now the case. People used to talk about 3-day-a-year Jews. Now it's maybe an hour a year Jew. That's very common. The Jews who used to come 3 days a year, 40 or 50 years ago, now they're coming for 1 hour on Yom Kippur. I don't have to read anybody's statistics. I know here in our own community, which is a relatively not assimilated community, there are certain members of our shul I see once a year for an hour. And that's all. I try to stay in touch during the year, but I don't see them in shul at all. And that's stunning. There's people who are members of a Chabad shul, right? And they're coming 1 hour a year. Imagine the people who are not members of any shul. They're not coming at all. There was a statistic released that the most observed ritual in Judaism is the Passover Seder. Now, I understand it's the food, but there are food on all holidays. And Passover food is the least appetizing. So you can't tell me it's not what's so enjoyable. Yom Kippur is certainly not that enjoyable, and everybody shows up. right? But there is this idea that matzah, it just somehow holds people. A lot of these seders have chametz on the table, unfortunately, together with matzah. Very confused. But Lot was like the first paradigm of a secular Jew, a lost Jew. He had values, but they were skewed. He had messed up values. His whole value system was all inverted. He wanted to have his daughters raped in order to save his guests. That doesn't make any sense. That's crazy stuff. But he still ate matzah. That was a certain thing. So he remembers from Avram, he's supposed to eat matzah. But that's a perfect example of the question we talked about learning Torah. There you have an example of it. Avram actually is eating matzah. Incidentally, it says about Yosef HaTzadik, since we're talking about Yom Tov, and we're talking about Torah, it says about Yosef HaTzadik that when he met his brothers, it says v'teveach tevach, that they slaughtered and they prepared a meal, v'hachin, and they prepared. So the Medrash Rabbah says, ein v'hachin ela l'Shabbat. V'hachin always refers to Shabbat because we prepare. You have to prepare for Shabbat. If you prepare before Shabbat, you have what to eat on Shabbat. So the Hadz of Shabbat, and the Medrash says that Yosef kept Shabbat, and because Yosef kept Shabbat, he had special rewards, even though he kept Shabbat, even though the Torah wasn't given yet, that his descendant, the tribe of Ephraim, was represented on Shabbat. They brought the seventh day, the offering in the Mishkan, when the tabernacle was consecrated, was inaugurated. So the first 12 days of the tabernacle, of the traveling house of Hashem that was inaugurated, each day a different tribe was represented, beginning from the day of Sunday, which was Yehuda on Sunday, and on the seventh day was Shabbos, and that was Nasi Livnei Ephraim. That was when the tribe of Ephraim brought this, because Ephraim, the descendant of Yosef, was rewarded for keeping Shabbos. So the obvious question on that Medrash is, didn't all the patriarchs keep all the mitzvahs? Why do we emphasize the idea of Yosef? Number one. Number two, what do you mean he kept Shabbos ad shelo nitna Torah? All the things they did were ad shelo nitna Torah. So there's a very beautiful explanation from the Rebbe, and I will share with you just a kernel of it, where he explains that Shabbos is different than the festivals, the Yamim Tovim, because the Yamim Tovim commemorate events, and in the times of the patriarchs, they didn't happen yet, those events. Yes, they commemorated Pesach, they did Passover things, but there was not a Passover. I don't know if Avram Avinu ate cheese blitzes or on Shavuot, or if he ate latkes on Hanukkah, right? But he commemorated, he knew there was something about certain days where things were done. We don't know exactly how and what, but there was something there, something to it. So when we talk about the festivals and the observances of the festivals, we're talking about the observances of something that didn't happen yet, right? But Shabbat commemorates what? Creation, exactly. That Hashem worked for 6 days and rested on the seventh. And when did that happen? The beginning of creation, long before the concept of the Torah being given. So Yosef actually lived with this ideal. He lived with this ideal. And one could suggest that Yosef is the idea of Shabbat. The concept of Shabbat is that it's a part of this world, and at the same time, it's apart from the world. Yosef was living within the framework of the halls of power. He was a prime minister, and yet he was a tzaddik elyon. He was always in a state of perfect connectivity to Hashem. So he was an embodiment of Shabbat. He was at once part of this world and apart from this world, which is Shabbat. That's an otherworldly day. So that's an example of a mitzvah or a commemoration that was kept before the Torah was given that had a little bit more of a profound meaning. Since we're on the subject of Shabbat, you should know that Moses also had a special connection to Shabbat. Before Moshe Rabbeinu killed the Egyptian taskmaster who was tormenting the Jew and had to run away and flee from Egypt, so in the beginning he was like a senior advisor to the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh knew he was Jewish at some point, but he figured he's a very talented, smart person, and he was brought up as an Egyptian, so he'll be a prince of Egypt and everything will be fine. Of course, he didn't realize that Moshe Rabbeinu is Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu wanted the Jewish people to be able to keep Shabbos, and he knew about Shabbat. So what did he do? He said to the Pharaoh, if you would allow your slaves a day off, you'd get much more productivity in the other 6 days. He said, in the final analysis, having them work continuously, or having them work for 6 days and take the seventh day off, you'll get more. There'll be more produced. And the Pharaoh liked money even more than he hated Jews. So he said, really? We could benefit more? Fine. If you think so, then we'll go along with that. And of course, Moshe chose the day of Shabbat. So even in Mitzrayim, already the Jewish people were observing a day of rest. Not Shabbat as we know it, but a day of rest. And that's why we say in our prayers, Yismach Moshe b'matanat chelko. Moshe rejoiced in the gift of his own portion. meaning Moshe had a special connection to Shabbos. And of course, Matan Torah, the Torah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on the day of Shabbat. And the day of Matan Torah was a special day in Moshe Rabbeinu's life from the very beginning, because Moshe Rabbeinu was born on Zayin Ba'adar, and when Moshe Rabbeinu was born, the home was lit up with light, and the light, says Rabbeinu Bachaya, is he was ra'ui, he was naturally suited to reflect the light of Torah, and because he was suited to reflect the light of Torah, that's why Nitmale Habayit Kula Ora, that's why the house actually resonated, illuminated with light, and his mother kept him, the Chumash says, for 3 months. And after 3 months, Moshe Rabbeinu had to be hidden because they were going to find him. Now you do the math. If you take 3 months from Zayin Ba'adar, 1 month is Zayin Nisan, the second month is Zayin Iyar, the third month would be Zayin Sivan. That means the day before the last day, he had to be taken out, which is the 6th day of Sivan. That means Moshe Rabbeinu was placed in the bulrushes, in the reeds, on the 6th day of Sivan, and that's when he was found, and named Moshe by Batya. The 6th of Sivan is the anniversary of Matan Torah. Matan Torah. So Moshe Rabbeinu, who was perfectly suited for Torah, was saved on the day of Matan Torah. So it was a special day in Moshe Rabbeinu's life. So that's like another... Anyway, I guess one question leads into the next. Let's, yes?
The story of Dina always puzzled me. And also, I don't know if I read somewhere or heard that Yosef married Dina's daughter.
Okay, so let's take one issue at a time. The story of Dina puzzles you. What it bothers you, or it puzzles you?
It bothers me.
Bothers me too. It bothers any good person. How could it not bother us? What's puzzling?
That Bas Yaakov, such a thing could happen. Yaakov, our patriarch.
You're asking, how could God allow such a thing to happen? You could add 6 million question marks to that from very recently. And unfortunately, millions of other question marks for over time. We have a lot of things we don't understand how Hashem could let them happen and why it happens. But Dina was blameless. Dina didn't do anything wrong. Unfortunately, she was raped. She was violated. Right? It was a terrible tragedy. And the sad thing was that up until that point, certain rules were respected. There was certain etiquette that was kept. Not a lot, but certain things were kept. So the one thing that had actually been passed down from after the Great Flood, the one thing people were still afraid to mess around with, was breaking the rules of sexual impropriety. That was one area they were careful. And we see an example of that with regard to Avraham Avinu coming down into Egypt. He says to Sarah, you better say that you're my sister, because then they'll give me gifts. Sounds ridiculous. He wants to make money off his wife. He's going to sell his wife. Or, I don't even want to say the words. He's going to rent his wife out, give me a gift. So, they give him the gifts. Sounds like a horrible guy, chas v'shalom. What is the pshat? So, the answer is that if Avraham Avinu comes as the husband of Sarah, what will happen to Sarah? She will be made available. Murder was not a problem in those days. Murder was okay. But came to a married woman, nobody would mess. So what do you do if the woman is married? You arrange an accident. It's very simple. Arrange an accident. Unfortunately, the camel happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. We're very sorry. And by the way, now that you're available, can we talk? So that's what would happen. Avraham Avinu knew that what would happen is that he was going to be killed, and they would make Sarah into a widow so they could take her. So what did Avraham Avinu do? He said, say that you are my sister. Now in the world at that milieu, people wouldn't take a woman without permission. So the older brother would have to give permission. So they would try to bribe Avraham. And Avraham would say, they'd give him gifts, and he would accept or not accept, and just play this game and just buy time until they could get out of there, because they needed food, they needed to survive. Unfortunately, that would have worked very well if not the king of the country. But the king of the country, it didn't work so well. When the Pharaoh came along, the Pharaoh didn't want to hear any stories. He wasn't going to give gifts and try to build a relationship. He simply sequestered Sarah. That's it. She became property of the royal Egyptian reality, and that was the end of the story. Taking it into the palace. So here, now we're really in trouble. Now what do we do? Okay, Hashem provided, and things worked out in the end, and Sarah is not hurt or molested, and Avram Avinu set free. Yitzchak has the same problem a generation later. He also says that it's my sister, because this was the norm. The norm was certain lines weren't crossed. Whenever we have lines, societal lines that are not crossed, the first time it gets crossed, it's always a big deal. But then after somebody does it once, even if there's disastrous consequences and the person suffers greatly, it pushes the envelope. So what happened is that the story of in Shechem with Dinah, the tragedy was that not only was Dinah raped, not only was she harmed, not only was she abused, but the tragedy was that there was a massive change in the climate of morality. And Nebuch had happened with a Jewish girl. That was the saddest thing of all. And that's why Shimon and Levi were so incensed. And the fact that the entire city was complicit, and they didn't protest this, they went along with this, was just unbelievable. That's why the Rambam says they all violated the code of the 7 Noachide laws, and they deserve to be killed. Although the Orach Chaim says they didn't come to kill everybody, they came to kill the perpetrator and to save their sister. And everybody said, no, over my dead body. I said, okay, if you want it that way, we have no choice. Even so, Yaakov was unhappy about the way it went down, but he backed him up. It's not simple at all. So, it bothers you, the story of Dinah? That's good. It should bother us. It's a very painful story. It's a very sad story. Now, as far as Yosef's wife, there are different midrashim. And there is one midrash is that Osnat was an adopted daughter of Potiphar, not actually Potiphar's blood child, and that it was actually Dinah's daughter. There is such a medrash. That's why I never made sense out of those medrashim. I don't know how she got to Egypt. There's a few things I can't figure out. That's one of them. I can't figure out how Elazar, the son of Aaron, married a woman who's from the family of Yisro, family of Yosef and family of Yisro. I never figured that one out. There's got to be some way to figure out. I mean, the Mefarshim say that his wife was maternally descended from Yosef and paternally descended from Yisro. So that means somebody else had to marry. How did Yisro's children end up in Mitzrayim? I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows exactly how this happened. Yisro was once a frequent guest at the Pharaoh's home, so maybe he had family there. He had a large family. Could be he left family. Could be part of his family joined the Jewish people. I mean, it's possible.
Joseph was buried in Egypt?
Joseph was buried in Egypt. This is an excellent question. So yes, Joseph was buried in Egypt, and the deal he made with his children was, I'm going to be buried here temporarily because there's no way you're going to be able to extricate my coffin from here, but when you leave, be sure to take me along. Now, there is a documentary that came out 2 years ago that provides stunning archaeological evidence, and I say stunning, more so than the guy who wrote made the documentary even knows, because he doesn't even realize how some of the things that he found line up perfectly with things in the Medrash. But one of the things they found there in a series of dwellings, which are distinctly Semitic, meaning coming from the land of Canaan. They're Canaanite in architecture. They're not like the rest of the Egyptian homes at all. And the rest of the things they found there, the artifacts, the DNA, nothing matches Egypt. It matches Canaan. One of the things they found there is a very large tomb, like a large royal tomb with 11 smaller tombs near it. And this follows the opinion of the Medrash very nicely, that all of the Shvatim were buried in Mitzrayim and that all of their bones were removed. Now they say that the coffin, they found this large coffin in that home and it was empty. Makes perfect sense. Although we have a Medrash that says that the Egyptians at some point did not allow Yosef to be interred in normative fashion. At some point, they emptied his tomb and they built an upside-down pyramid, or like a man-made lake. And then a heavy lead coffin was sunk into the lake. And in doing so, they said they knew that Joseph going from Mitzrayim with them was a precondition. So this was one of the ways they ensured the Jewish people could never leave Egypt because they'd never be able to retrieve the coffin. What happened? Moshe Rabbeinu on the morning of Pesach, they have a problem. So Moshe Rabbeinu wrote on a slip of paper, Alei Shor, rise ox. Ox is the animal euphemism or metaphor that Jacob uses in bestowing the blessing. So he throws that paper into the water, and then the coffin bobs to the top of the water. And Moshe Rabbeinu himself took personal responsibility for transporting the bones of Yosef. And then when they came to Kriyas Yamsuf, it says, Hayom Ra Vayonas, the sea saw and shrank. Ma Ra, says the Medrash, Ra Arono Shel Yosef. It saw the coffin, or according to another version, Atzmas Yosef. It saw the bones of Yosef. So when it saw Yosef had the strength to stand up against his Yetzer Hara, that's when the sea fled. The sea was afraid of Yosef. And Yosef's coffin or bones were carried throughout the desert, throughout the duration. Of course, Moshe Rabbeinu himself did not manage to inter Yosef. That was only done by the Jewish people. The spot of Yosef's burial, we believe, is the spot of a piece of land that Yaakov, our father Jacob, purchased right outside Shechem, B'mea Kesita. For 100 Kesita, which is a small denomination of money, he purchased, the first thing he did coming to the land of Israel was purchase a plot. So he said, my grandfather purchased a plot for me, Machpelah, Hebron. I'm asking you to take me to the land of Israel. I purchased a piece of land, and I'll give that to you. And that's why Yosef is buried in Shechem.
Is there a marker?
Oy vey, is there a marker in Shechem? Not only is there a marker, there's a whole tomb in Shechem. But tragically, when our Jewish government gave away the city of Shechem to the monsters, the Arab monsters living over there, so the Philistinians destroyed the tomb of Yosef. What did Yosef do to them? I don't know. But they literally destroyed the tomb of Yosef with pick and hammer and fire. They ripped apart the tomb piece by piece. Disgusting. The world had no problem with that. That was fine. That's okay. Because they, very nice people, peace partners. What about the Shvatim? Okay, so we think we know where Dinah is buried. And some of the Shvatim, I think they identify some of the Shvatim as possible graves of some of the Shvatim. I think they know where God is. But you have to remember, we're talking about thousands of years ago, right? And we're talking about times where the land of Israel was barren and desolate for decades. I've spoken to people who've gone back to their shtetl 60 years, 70 years after the Holocaust. Some people say they recognize everything. A lot of people say they recognize nothing. They couldn't figure out what was going on. Nothing made sense. It's not what they remembered. So when you're away from a place for a long time, and then it's not even the same people coming back, and they were in the age of photography and all kinds of ways of preserving records, people didn't know what necessarily was going on in Israel. Interestingly, a lot of the places, the holy places that were later maintained, at least the location was known, was because of various Arabic nomads moved in and out of Canaan. There's no indigenous people for the land of Israel. The only indigenous people ever was the Jewish people. The Palestinian quote-unquote museum has nothing in it. They have a museum they built, a beautiful building, but there's nothing in it. There is no history there. There's no Palestinian currency. There's no Palestinian king. There's no Palestinian culture. It doesn't exist. It's indistinguishable from the Arabs who are living in Jordan, from Arabs who are living in Lebanon, Arabs living in Syria. There's no difference. It's not a unique. The only indigenous peoples were peoples who lived there before the Jewish people came. The Canaanites, who are all gone, all wiped out, all disappeared, or joined the Jewish people. So the Jewish people are the only indigenous people, and we are the only people who had governments and currencies and civilizations that flourished and fell and were rebuilt for a very long time, for several thousand years. So what happened is that various nomadic groups moved in and out. In 1860s, 1870s, Palestine, as the British called it, at that time was before Britain, was a Turkish province, was barren. It was an empty place, right? But the various nomads, they kept up holy places. So, for example, the cave of Shmuel Hanavi ended up with the Arab name Nebi Samuel, right? So we presume that if they call Nebi Samuel, which is Arabic for Shmuel Hanavi, or the Navi Shmuel, that's probably the resting place of Shmuel Hanavi. And there's a big mosque built over there, of course, because that's the style. You have to build a victory mosque of every place. So they built a mosque to show, no, this is. He was the first. He was a Muslim. He was not Jewish. That makes no sense. But whatever. It doesn't have to make sense to certain people. So that's where Yosef's buried. Was that the last question, Ron?
Did like Moshe married Tzipporah and Abraham married Sarah and all these people, the women were not Jewish, so how did they convert? Or Shlomo Melech had 1,000 wives and some were not Jewish?
Okay, so you're asking good questions, but they're two different questions. You're asking about the women of famous Jewish men and asking how are they Jewish, but you're conflating Shlomo HaMelech with Avraham Avinu or with Moshe Rabbeinu. That's not going to work for the simple reason that Shlomo HaMelech is after Matan Torah and Avraham and Moshe are before Matan Torah. So let's divide your question. Let me try to answer both of your questions. You're asking about what made Sarai Jewish. I'll ask you back, what made Avraham Jewish? This was, Avraham and Sarai were in this together. They developed together. Right? So then what made Rivka Jewish? The variables that we use today to establish one's Jewish identity come from Har Sinai, comes from Sinai. In fact, the methodology of conversion replicates the experience at Sinai. At Har Sinai, when the Jewish people went through the metamorphosis of converting to Judaism, if you will, the males underwent Milah, which is circumcision. They entered into the covenant. That they did when they were about to leave Mitzrayim. And that was in order for them to eat the Korban Pesach. One of the famous questions that are asked by the Achronim about this is, since they had a bris milah in order to eat a Korban Pesach, and a convert has to have a brit milah in order to accept upon himself Torah and mitzvahs, how does that work? And the answer is that the idea of participating in the Korban Pesach meant Torah and mitzvahs. It meant renouncing idolatry a la Egyptian style. It meant embracing Torah values, which they didn't fully understand or know, most of them. So when they went through that original Brit Milah, and then before Matan Torah, everybody immersed in a mikveh. And after immersing in a mikveh, there was also an offering that was brought. And we hear of the blood being divided and the blood being sprinkled. There wasn't a mishkan, there wasn't a tabernacle, but there was a korban. And so till today, the way conversion is affected is b'milah, b'tvila, u'b'korban. Now you're going to ask me, so what happens to converts today? And the answer is that really to become fully Jewish, we need milah and tvila. So what's the korban about? The korban is about participating in temple activities. Just like there are certain people who need an extra atonement. It's called mechusar kapara. They're missing an atonement, or to get that extra atonement, they need to bring a special korban. So when Mashiach will come, all converts will have to bring a special offering for them to be able to participate in temple services, as will many of us who are mechusar kapara. But as far as becoming a Jew is concerned, there has to be immersion in a kosher mikveh, and there has to be a brit milah. So ask me the question, what about a man who was circumcised, the Gentile man who was circumcised prior to when he even thought of being Jewish, the surgical procedure? And the answer is, has to be hatafas dambris. A small amount of blood has to be taken from that area for the sake of bris milah, or the covenant of Avraham Avinu. So you're going to ask me, what about a woman? So the Gemara says, Noshim kimanda mihili damya, that women have the virtue of brit milah without actually going through a procedure, and don't require that procedure. So how does a woman become Jewish? The answer is by immersion in the mikveh. Now the immersion in the mikveh has to happen along with kabbalat mitzvot. You have to accept upon yourself the mitzvot, which is the meaning when people talk about a halachic conversion. If you convert to Judaism and you don't accept upon yourself to do mitzvot, what kind of conversion is that? The answer is, it's not. It's not a conversion. It's not real. So it's not binding. So you never became Jewish. Now the Rambam's opinion is that the only way the tevilah, the immersion, is effective and binding is if it's in the presence of a Beth Din. So if it's a Beth Din, it means you need 3 Torah scholars who embody Torah values and live by its dictates. But if you have quote-unquote rabbis who eat pork and who violate Shabbat, could they be a Beth Din? Of course not. So how could a Reformed convert be a convert? It's the biggest joke. If the rabbis or the Beth Din themselves doesn't do any mitzvahs, and the person who purports to be converting is not accepting any mitzvahs, so then what makes them Jewish? Because they watch the Holocaust film and they eat bagels and lox? It doesn't mean anything. So a person will come along and say, well, for us it's good, this is our Reform way. You can do whatever you want, but you have to realize that over the ages there have always been movements that deviated from Torah. Always. We never ever had a time with Jewish people didn't have a movement that went away from the Torah, from Matan Torah. And guess what? These movements come and go. Sometimes they're more powerful, sometimes they have more numbers, and they always have more money, but they disappear in the end. And the only thing that has remained continuous is Torah Judaism. It's this myth that Orthodox Judaism is 18th century Judaism. It's a myth. It's a myth. It's a lie. It's not true. Torah Judaism is a continuous building, a continuum of Torah scholarship from the days of the patriarchs. It's continuous. Everything follows the same system. Have there been developments in areas? Of course there are developments. Shlomo HaMelech made a new injunction. Avraham Avinu may have known of it, but Shlomo HaMelech made a new injunction. Hanukkah was established at a certain point. That's fine. It's within a certain framework. There's a very specific framework. And the framework requires Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was disbanded almost 2,000 years ago. So we don't have any new mitzvah. There's no such thing. Nothing that's binding upon all the Jewish people. There are no developments in that area. The only developments we have today are spiritual developments. Developments in profundity, developments in methodology, analysis of Torah. But it all follows the same system. So in order to convert to Judaism, a person that has to immerse in a kosher mikveh, which is also not so simple, and the kosher mikveh has to have a bezdin, a kosher bezdin, which means people who live by and affirm Torah values, who believe in what they're doing, and that the person who immerses in the mikveh has to accept upon his or herself that they're going to live a Torah lifestyle. Now, does that mean they have to be the biggest tzaddik? I mean, let's be realistic. How many big tzaddikim are there? A lot of us do things wrong, but at least it has to be basics. So, if a woman immerses in mikveh and she commits to keeping Shabbat and keeping family purity and keeping kosher, so maybe even if she doesn't dress so modest, it doesn't mean she's not Jewish. And that's the question about people asking about Ivanka Trump. She doesn't look Orthodox. I know you're thinking, and this is an open forum, so I'm not afraid to answer. I'm B'chlal in general not afraid. I'm not afraid to say the truth. I try to offend nobody. I have no interest in fighting with anybody. But the truth is the truth, and the truth will not change. And nobody can change the truth, whether it's politically correct or politically incorrect is not relevant. What has to be said is the truth. Is Ivanka Trump Jewish? I hope she is. I would like to think that she is. If the rabbi that oversaw her conversion was a man who believes in Hashem and believes in the Torah, even if theologically or philosophically he's like on a very, very left end of that spectrum, but as long as he still is within the framework of Torah Judaism, which means that there's a respect for the profundity and the importance of halacha. And to the best of my knowledge, Ivanka does keep Shabbos, and I know for a fact that she does keep mikveh, or at least she goes to places and looks for the mikveh. I can't tell you which does every month. I'm not a policeman, but I know that mikveh is a part of Jared and Ivanka's life, and I know that they keep kosher. So then she's a proper convert. In that case, she's Jewish. Could she be more devout? Who am I to judge her? I could also be more devout. Probably every one of you could be more devout. We could all be more devout. But as long as there's the basics, right? So a man needs to have Brit Milah and mikveh, a woman needs to have mikveh, and if that's the case, then they become what's called halachically Jewish. And for us, halacha is reality. Halacha is not a cute thing, it's not nice, it's not sweet, it's reality. Which means if the matzah is halachically matzah, baked in under 18 minutes, you eat it on Pesach, we believe it enriches your soul and it enhances your spiritual sensitivity. If it was baked in 18 and a half minutes, it's chametz. It destroys your soul. It ruins your spirituality. It distances you from Hashem. And that's what the halacha is. A psak halacha, a ruling of halacha, that's a reality. So the question is, does it fit into the framework of halacha? And there can only be one answer. Yes or no. There can't be gray areas. A Rav has to give a psak halacha. A psak halacha has to be a ruling, has to be a psak. Did I answer the question? Let me just finish answering the question. So you cannot ask questions on before Matan Torah. How did Tzipporah become Jewish? How is Moshe Jewish? What we call Jewish in today's framework is in the post-Sinai reality of leading up to Sinai. That's where we learn the methodology of conversion. And post-Sinai, that's how conversion happened. Now, how did Tzipporah become Jewish in those days? I can't really answer that question because I don't know. I don't know how anybody was technically Jewish, but I'm sure that Moshe Rabbeinu, who is the most perfect specimen of humanity and the holiest tzaddik and one of the greatest Nevi'im, only Mashiach, it would be even a greater Navi than Mashiach, you could bet your bottom dollar that Tzipporah was 100% committed to Jewishness and Jewish values and monotheism and all the things that Judaism, and in whatever manner it was, she converted. Maybe you could ask the same question about all the Shvatim. Who did the Shvatim marry? There's a dispute about this, but according to one opinion, they married Canaanite women. How did those Canaanite women become Jewish? How did Rachel and Leah become Jewish? How did anybody become Jewish?
How Ruth became Jewish.
No, Ruth is a separate thing. Ruth is after Matan Torah. Ruth is after Matan Torah. But so we're going, even though chronologically we should talk about Ruth first, but I want to answer your question about Shlomo HaMelech. So you should know that as a rule, we're not permitted to convert people for a reason. You don't come to God for love of a man or woman. If you convert to Judaism because you love a man or a woman, it's an insincere conversion. It's not right. It doesn't make any sense. Think about it. You come to faith because you love God, not because you love a person. It doesn't add up. So we're not supposed to. And if somebody converts to becoming part of the Jewish people because the Jewish people are successful and he thinks he'll be rich and famous and powerful if he's Jewish, then that's not a good reason to become Jewish. You come for love of Hashem, not for love of money, not for love of fame, not for love of comfort or security or luxury. If somebody comes because they're afraid of something, they're trying to escape, and that's to become Jewish, also not the ideal situation. Now, the Rambam says, this is the reason that during the times of King David and times of King Solomon, they in principle did not accept any Gerim, did not accept any converts. Because at the times of King David, they were terrified of the Jewish people, so people would have done it out of fear. In times of King Solomon, things are so good for the Jewish people, people would have done it out of love. Not love of God, love of a good life, love of fun, love of peace, love of supremacy, or whatever else it was that Jewish people enjoyed at the time. Having said that, the Rambam says, so what about Shimshon? Shimshon is a prophet. He's a holy man. Shimshon is not a Hulk Hogan, just like a boxer. He's a holy. He married a Pelishti. Like he just married. Like what does that mean? How did that work? Well, Shlomo HaMelech is called Yedid Hashem, the friend of God. When he just married a woman, just like that. And the Rambam explains that there is first best case scenario in halacha. This is called lechatchila and bidi aved. The way it should be, and sometimes the way things end up. The way it should be, we should not be accepting converts if there's any kind of ulterior reason. It has to be done really for an altruistic purpose. However, having said that, if they do convert, and if for whatever reason the Bezdin, whether because the Bezdin is hedyotis, the Bezdin is substandard and doesn't really get it, but they mean well, or whether it's because there was some reason that the Bezdin decided this would be a good idea to do, so then the conversion is a conversion. The Ram says we have to wait and see where it goes. But he also says, and this is in halacha, that as long as there was an acceptance of mitzvahs, if they later move away from that, then it's like any Jew who moves away from it. Sad that somebody moved away from Yiddishkiet. Our job is to bring them back to Yiddishkiet. But if the conversion was sincere, and if they kept Shabbos, and they were eating kosher, and living a life like an observant Jew, and then later fell away from it, it's the unfortunate story of many, many Jews. And that's a lot of times that you see with many, many converts, that they, at some point, they're very devout, and oftentimes they fall away later, and that's not a good situation. It's not like we have enough wayward Jews. You have to bring more wayward Jews in, right? Enough trouble as it is, right? But having said that, some converts are amazing. And some converts put the rest of us to shame with their devotion to Torah and with their commitment. So it goes two ways. Like there's an expression in the Gemara that says the converts are really difficult and not good for the Jews. One interpretation is because they deviate. Most of them fall away. Another interpretation is they make the Jews look bad. Because they're much more observant, much more meticulous, much more devoted than the rest of the Jewish brethren. A person does not have to be 100% perfect in order to convert. It says, mixes kalas, mixes chamuris. Tell them some of the mitzvahs. A person is allowed to be in an ongoing process of learning. And finally, I should point out that when we speak about converts, the Gemara says, Gershen is Gayer. A convert who converts, not Goyshen is Gayer, not a Gentile who converts, not a non-Jew, which makes no sense. How could be a Gershen is Gayer? It's like baked bread that was baked. It wasn't baked, it was dough and it was baked. Like, why would you? Because it's a Gentile becomes a Jew. The answer is very simple, that the person who is destined to convert was always destined to convert. And there's a neshama waiting for them. They just had to make it happen. In modern parlance, you had to download. There was a download available. You just had to download it. And once you downloaded the program, so now you're on a new operating system. So some people are born with that potential. That doesn't mean that everybody who's born with that potential actualizes that potential. So that's the idea of Gershon as Gayer. Now with regard to Rus, Rus was a very, very sincere convert. And there's a discussion about Rus's first conversion. Rus, it seems, converted twice, right? Or may have converted twice. This is when she married her husband in Moab, and then when she comes later back to Israel. Some of the Mefarshim say, no, she converted once, and the conversion was substandard, but nonetheless, a conversion is a conversion. Others say that later Rus reconverted after she came to Israel, and this is, an interesting discussion. But many of the details of Rus and Naomi are used as the foundation for halachas of conversion. Like, for example, the way Naomi talks to her, she says, don't bother. You don't need to do this. And she says, no, I do want to do it. I want to do it. And she says, I'm rejecting it. There's no reason. It's not that there's a man waiting for me. I don't have anything good, materially. Doing this for the love of God. Incidentally, Ruth is the ultimate female convert, as Jethro is the ultimate male convert. That's the paradigm of what would a perfect convert look like? Who's the most famous, or the most praiseworthy or laud-worthy convert? Yisro is the most famous male convert, and Ruth is the most famous female convert. And the fact that she's the grandmother of David HaMelech and Jewish royalty speaks volumes. That says a lot. Listen, Rabbi Akiva was the greatest of all scholars. According to the Medrash, Moshe Rabbeinu foresaw Rabbi Akiva teaching Torah in the future, and he said, you should give the Torah through him. He understands it better than me. Rabbi Akiva's Ben Gadim. Rabbi Akiva was directly descended from converts who were not observant. Well, if they were not observant, how were they converts? They were converts. They joined the Jewish people. They fell away. They did not behave properly. But look what they ended up producing. Rabbi Akiva. Onkelos, the major commentator on the Torah. He grew up as Achilles, a Roman with a Greek name. Was not Jewish. Rabbi Meir, one of the great scholars, that said he was Meir Einei Chacham. He lit up the eyes of the sages. He was a Roman. He was a convert. The prophet Avadia, a convert from the descendants of Esav. And many other over the ages, many famous tzaddikim, famous men and women who made enormous contributions to Jewish life, who were also converts. So, does that answer your question? What about Shlomo's wives? So Shlomo's wives, it was not an ideal situation. No question, not ideal. But he did not go and marry non-Jewish women. They converted. There were halachic conversions, halachic weak conversions, halachic conversions that if we had to choose, we would say, no, that's not an ideal conversion. That's not the kind of conversion that we should have.
He let them, pray to their God.
It does say that they did turn to their gods. The question is that literal or euphemistic? Is it relatively speaking, or is it to be taken literal? And even if they later did turn away from Torah and mitzvahs and did later re-embrace their gods, that they were still converted though. It's not like Shlomo HaMelech just married non-Jewish women. There was a conversion. At one point they did accept Torah and mitzvahs, and unfortunately they deviated later on. Like I said, there are many people who deviate, and it's not a good thing. It's unfortunate, but they're still Jewish. Shlomo was such a tzaddik, and he was so wise. In general, you should know that when we talk about biblical figures, we would do well not to superimpose our own lives over theirs. They were people like us, but much more so. Much more so. They really lived in a different level of consciousness. We're talking about the biblical figures. We're talking about people who have this cosmic level of importance. We would not be wise to judge them with our own personal bandwidth, or try to fit them into what we know as human frailty or human triumph. It's like comparing the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew to Shakespeare. They're both writers. Doesn't make any sense. You're talking about the great classical writers of all time. You're talking about whatever pop culture books. Okay, it's not. You can't use the same yardstick. So we have to be careful when we talk about the biblical figures. It has to be done with a certain sense of awe and a certain sense of reverence. Not say, Shlomo did this or this, I could do this too.
But on the other hand, he knew the Torah, and the Torah said that you're not allowed to marry more than 18 wives. So there are many questions about Shlomo HaMelech. There are many things which are hard to understand about Shlomo. There are things hard to understand about David HaMelech also.
In a marriage, when two people want to get married, is there a law or something, I don't know how to phrase the question, that a Levi should marry a Levi or an Israelite should marry an Israelite?
It's an excellent question.
Such a thing?
Okay, so let me reframe your question. You're asking whether it comes to marriages amongst Jews, whether there is any kind of hierarchy. Okay, so that's a good question. There is, in the Talmud, a discussion of Kohanim marrying Kohanim. And it's called In Vehagefen Be'in Vehagefen. That the branch of the grape, or the vine of the grape, finds the vine of a grape. And that's considered to be a very, like a special kind of marriage. Having said that, as a rule, a person who is Jewish, without any things attached to them, could marry anybody. A Kohen can marry an Israelite or a Levite, and we're generally not careful about these things. Like people who say, "Oh, I'm a Kohen, I want to marry a Kohenet." We don't have that attitude or approach. Having said that, there are certain Jews who are considered to be 100% Jewish, but would not be able to marry in that kind of freedom. So, for example, there are certain nations that if and when they convert, they may be 100% Jewish, but they still cannot marry into the Jewish people. And who is those? That's the nation that Rus comes from. Moab, Ammon and Moab, who were descendants of Lot. Lot fathered those two children with his two daughters, and they became great nations. And it says, an Ammoni and a Moavi, a male member of the Moabite clan or nation, and a male member of the Ammonite clan or nation may not marry into the congregation of Israel. However, a Moavit and Ammonit may. And there are two very famous converts, one a Moavit, and that's of course Ruth, and then there's Naamah, who is the Ammonit, and she's also a famous female convert, and she's an Ammonit. So that's an example of certain limitations which would be placed on a conversion. It should be pointed out that the Rambam says we don't know who these nations are anymore because Sancheiriv, in his attempt to build an empire that would withstand the test of time, he displaced peoples. He didn't want to leave them. If he left them in their original country, they would maintain this jingoism or patriotic kind of fervor, and then that would allow a possibility of sedition, or they would secede from his empire because people would rally together and they would have this common patriotism that would bind them. So he figured if he took these people and he displaced them, put them in different parts of the world, then in that way he would inhibit, if not altogether kill, whatever past culture was there. And in many ways he was successful. In some ways he wasn't. His mistake was to start up with the Jews, and that didn't go well for him in the end. The first 10 tribes he exiled, but Hashem saves Chizkiyahu, and then Sennacherib meets a bitter end. Point being that the Rambam says those who live where Moab is today are not the Moavi of once upon a time. Not Moavi, right? So the Moavi. And the Ammoni are not Ammoni of today. And the Mitzri is not the Mitzri of today. Which anyway is not the Mitzri because according to that latest documentary and this incredible information, it turns out that the people known as the Hyksos came to Mitzrayim just after Yetzias Mitzrayim. So anyway they would have replaced the Egyptians there. But he displaced everybody. Now there's a dispute with the Ramban. Ramban says that the people living in Egypt are later the original Egyptians returned. But that doesn't mean all of them, and it doesn't mean everybody. It's a mix. And we say, Kol de Parash miruba Parash. Anything, whenever you separate something from a volume, we say it's from Ruba. It comes from the majority. And the reality is that when somebody comes to convert, this is what the Achreinim say. It's the idea of Kol de Parash. They're separated themselves. So they separate themselves. We have no way of making them part of one nation or the other. So today there will be no limitations for that. Today any convert is able to get married. However, Kohanim have a limit. The Kohanim must marry a Yisrael, a natural Israel, not a convert. So that's a limitation for Kohanim specifically.
Women don't hold the Levi or Cohen or...
Women don't identify by Levi or Cohen. It's not entirely correct. It's somewhat correct. So first of all, lineage is a male bloodline. Being Jewish comes from your mother, and the lineage of what kind of Jew you are comes from your father. But if a woman is descended from a Levite father, and then she has a firstborn baby boy, she does not do Pidyon Haben, because she's a Levite. Okay? So it's not like it doesn't matter at all. And there are opinions in the Talmud that a female Kohenet can still receive certain privileges of being a Kohenet, certainly before she's married. without a question that she has those privileges, and sometimes she can even regain those privileges if she didn't have any Israelite children. There's a story in the Gemara of a woman who was a Kohenet, who married a non-Kohen. So she lost her Kohen status. She became an Israel. She could not eat the fancy food called Truma. Now, unfortunately for her, her husband died. So she should revert to being a Kohenet. But fortunately for her, she had a son. Pardon me, she had a daughter. She had a daughter. So since that daughter is a descendant of an Israelite man, so she could not rejoin the Kohen family. That daughter ended up marrying a Kohen, and that they had a child who was, of course, a Kohen, who became a Kohen Gadol, and then his parents died. So what was left was the Savta, the grandmother, who was once a Kohenet, and she has a grandson who's a Kohen Gadol. And she was not allowed to eat Truma because of the Kohen Gadol. Because since the Kohen Gadol was descended from Israelite seed, so she said, may there be many like you in Israel, but not like you, because you robbed me of my Kohen privileges. So there is such a concept. Now, having said that, it's important for us to take note of the fact that the lineage, the specific of how somebody will be categorized, will always follow the father. Right.
And the woman follows the husband.
The woman follows the husband. Marriage changes the spiritual status of a woman. So if an Israelite woman marries a Kohen, she will become like a Kohenet, that she'll be able to eat the Truma, whereas somebody who's a non-Kohen eats it, gets cut off from his people. It's like Yiddish chametz on Pesach. Whereas if a Kohenet, a female Kohen marries an Israelite man, now she is no longer permitted to eat it. So I think that was your question?
Yeah.
Villette, you have the last question for today.
I wanted to understand with Moshe and Aaron, and how Itamar and Elazar continue with Moshe's anointing and responsibility.
As his like spiritual children, you mean?
Right, and then, but Moshe the blessing went to Joshua.
Right.
So what happened to Moses? I always wanted to.
What happened to the children of Moses? Right. Okay, so let me reframe your question. You want to understand why is it that when it came to Aaron's children, even though Elazar and Itamar died, right? Nadav and Avihu die, but Elazar and Itamar do replace their father. Elazar becomes the Kohen Gadol, right? But when it comes to Moshe Rabbeinu, he has two sons, Gershom and Eliezer, and they do not replace him. Instead, a disciple, Yehoshua bin Nun, replaces him. Okay. So let me say three things. Firstly, Aaron HaKohen's position can only be held by a Kohen. So there was no other Kohen. The Kohen had to be a descendant of Aaron. It could be either Aaron's son or his grandson, which actually it was. His son became the Kohen Gadol after him. That was Elazar. And after Elazar, Pinchas, who was Elazar's son, became the Kohen Gadol after him. So obviously every Kohen is a descendant from the Kohen family, is paternally descended from Aaron, the high priest, and he will necessarily be from the Kohen family. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to progeny, and it comes to positions of importance, so usually, as a rule, we say that the certain misra, kol misra b'Yisrael, any position of prominence and importance, always passes first to the children. Ideally, it should pass to the children. The children should replace their parents, as it says, tachas avesecha yeh. In the place of the parents will be the children. But, which brings us to number three, that does not mean that we allow for nepotism. Because along with the idea of Yerusha, of inheritance, it has to be appropriate. And if it's not appropriate, it doesn't work. That doesn't mean every child is going to fulfill the father's position, but it means that somebody has to be suited for a position. So the Rambam was the most amazing millennial scholar, and his son Rabbi Avraham was a great tzaddik and a great scholar, but he was no Rambam. But the position that the Rambam held as being the chief rabbi of Mitzrayim, of Egypt, which is one of the most prominent Jewish communities in the world, which they have a special name lifted from the scripture called the Nagid. So the Nagid of Mitzrayim was the Rambam, and after the Rambam, his son, who was Rabbi Avraham, becomes Nagid of Mitzrayim. He was qualified to be the Nagid. It wasn't like there was somebody much better than him was qualified. He was qualified to be the chief rabbi of Egypt. Did he become Rebbe of the Jewish people the way the Rambam was? No, of course not. Of course not. So there has to be the possibility of doing so. You have to be worthy. And the Talmud says that sometimes somebody cannot be not as wise, but at least as God-fearing. So if he's Einim Mala Mekayim B'Chachma, but Mala Mekayim B'Yira, at least it's his reverence, his sense of awe and reverence, that itself would be sufficient also. But at least there's a sense of loyalty, devotion, commitment, awe, reverence, respect. So somebody who's not so wise will seek counsel of wise people, but at least he's worthy from a spiritual perspective being a leader. And then we talk about certain positions where the qualities necessary are simply overwhelming. So if you have to have those qualities. If you don't have those qualities, it's not possible to replace it. And that's where a disciple comes in. And oftentimes in history it was a son-in-law. Sometimes it was a son-in-law. So our Rebbe was a son-in-law of the previous Rebbe. He was also a direct descendant of the third Rebbe and had his name. So there's also a bloodline. The Schneerson family is an extraordinary family. And some of the members of the Schneerson family were absolutely extraordinary. And some of them were not extraordinary. That's the truth. Some of them were very ordinary. It's needless to say that when you talk about a position of supreme importance, somebody has to be worthy. And if they're not worthy, then we don't create positions for people or stick people into positions that they are simply not capable of handling. That's nepotism. You know the word nepotism comes from the Italian word for nephew, which is nipo. Is the popes did not have any children, or at least not officially. So they have a nephew, right? So they would adopt that nephew, and they oftentimes would push their nephew into a position where he was really not deserving. He didn't fit that position. So why was he there? Because of family. That doesn't make any sense. That's called nepotism. Nepotism is wrong. I mean, to use family in a position because they're family, but they're not qualified, is wrong. That's nepotism. To have make the assumption that somebody who lives a certain way and believes a certain way and functions a certain way would probably raise children who are in that image makes perfect sense. So very, very often, rabbis would be replaced by their children. I mean, it was the most natural thing. Who would be better suited? Somebody was raised by that rabbi, probably his own child. He would have his natural abilities. He would have his qualities. If he was totally unsuited, it was like a talk about them. Now, true, sometimes the position was made grander by the person who occupied it. Like the Rambam's position was made bigger. The Rambam was much bigger than Nagid. It was an honor for the position of Nagid that the Rambam was the Nagid rather than the other way around. True, but nonetheless, his son Avram was fit for that position, and his future generations, for a number of generations, were fit for that position. So Moshe Rabbeinu's sons clearly were not fit for the position of leadership, spiritual leadership. Now, it's interesting you ask this question because Moshe Rabbeinu himself desperately wanted to see his son take on some kind of leadership position. And Moshe Rabbeinu suggested that the Jewish people's leadership should be divided in two. There should be a political leader and there should be a spiritual leader. There should be a Rebbe who will talk about Torah, and then there should be a person who will be the CEO of the Jewish people. And Hashem said to Moshe Rabbeinu, that's not the Jewish way. The person who will be responsible for making the decisions has to also be the Torah leader. So Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to see his son was probably very capable of being a great leader, but not a Rebbe. And Hashem says, no, it's not the case. In much, much more modern times, the Baal Shem Tov had a son who was a great tzaddik, whose name was Reb Tzvi. And when the Baal Shem Tov passed on, they assumed his son Reb Tzvi would lead the Chassidim. And he was an ineffectual, weak personality. He was not, Chassidic movement was floundering. A year later on the Baal Shem Tov's yard site, the Maggid of Mizrich was an outstanding disciple, had this nocturnal vision, this dream with the Baal Shem Tov said, you don't want. And Reb Tzvi had the same dream. And at the meal, the Yom Tov meal, he took off his shtreimel, as the story goes, his fur hat, and he put it on the head of the Maggid, and he said, it's your job. It was a mistake. I was never supposed to be that person. I mean, to have the humility to do that is extraordinary. He said, it was supposed to be you. And so the Maggid became the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, not his son Reb Tzvi. And she was a tzaddik. He was a malo makayim b'yira. It was like an incredible holy man, but not the kind of leader that was necessary. So, in summation, to recap, oftentimes progeny will replace their parents, and if it's possible, it's the ideal way, but it's not necessarily so. And that's very important, because if it was necessarily so, we would end up with a situation of nepotism, or people who are not capable in a position, and then everybody would suffer. Then the community suffers, the public suffers, the Jewish people suffer, and that's not okay.
But yet we still say
Well, who says the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? Sometimes apples don't fall far from the tree. Sometimes there's a hurricane and apples end up very, very far from the tree. It's not exactly a verse, a scriptural verse that apples don't fall far from the tree. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do. Anyway.
But you just think a person like Moshe that was so great.
He was so great. Well,
No.
but he's not the first one to have children who are not as great as he.
Yeah.
Avraham Avinu had a son named Yitzchak, and he had a son named Yishmael. And Yitzchak and Rivka had a son named Esav, and and that didn't work out exactly so. And all the children of Yaakov were great, but not everybody was as great as the other. There was different. They were selected for different positions. So it's a mystery of nature and nurture. We have children growing up in the same house, same variables, eating the same food, same parents, and some of them turn out so different from one another. And not sometimes they're equal. They're both fantastic, but very different. How did that happen? Right? No. This is the way of the world.
Follow, say, in the parent's footsteps, the parent might blame himself.
I don't know. Listen, the blame game is not necessarily a wise thing. We certainly have responsibility. Let's put it that way. You cannot say, my children will turn out how they turn out. It's not my problem. It's our responsibility. I don't know if it's our fault, but it's our responsibility. And on that note of responsibility, let's conclude. We all have many responsibilities. I don't know what's your fault or not, but we have to take our responsibility seriously. And if we do our best, like it says in the Mishnah, Yegaita umatzasa, you do your best, you'll find success that's beyond what you even imagine, common, then that's believable. We should all have nachas on our children. We should be successful in our missions. We should be able to hear and share good news together. Amen.